Hey, how's it going, everybody? My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this is the New Movie Diary, in which I tell you about new and up-and-coming releases and try to give you some straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. Last time I did one of these, I traveled all the way to the Paris Theater in Manhattan to see what turned out to be a rather delightful premiere screening of Ellie Foumbi's psychological thriller, Our Father, the Devil, and you can look below to find a link to that. That doesn't have a general release date yet, but it's definitely one to keep an eye out for. This week, though, I did not do what is becoming an increasingly normal phenomenon for me of traveling pretty far out of my neck of the woods to see something I'm actually interested in seeing. I mean, what can I say? And I'll be totally transparent with whoever's out there watching this. I can be kind of a snob, so take that as you will. And I don't mean like a dilettante in a salon, nose up, sipping wine, holding the flute correctly, however you hold a wine flute correctly. I don't mean that kind of snob. I mean just, folks, I just don't get very excited by the box office these days. The past month has actually been pretty solid because I did actually do a double feature at my local AMC of Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, and then Polite Society, both of which are also good. And look, you should get off your butt and go see them on the big screen. It's just better. I'm sorry, it is just better. It's always been better. Streaming sucks. Suboptimal viewing experience. I've been in some pretty shitty theatrical circumstances, but I tell you, as long as the movie is big and the room is dark, it's a hell of a lot better than just watching something on my TV or laptop and getting that ugly feeling when you realize the Wi-Fi is waiting and the image resolution is getting all murky. Not like the compression on streaming movies is very great to begin with, but come on. I'm getting a little carried away here. Suffice it to say, I go to the movies quite often, but look, I sympathize with folks who can't find the motivation to get up and go see a movie in theaters, either because they don't want to deal with rude people because, hey, yeah, there's a big problem now with people going to the movies and treating it like it's their living room and texting and talking. It's everywhere. It's a big deal, at least to me. But also because, look, what do you want to see? Do you want to see the new Super Mario Brothers movie? Do you want to see the third Guardians of the Galaxy? Sorry. Do you want to see the 32nd MCU movie? Do you want to go see the 4th John Wick? Do you want to go see the 5th Evil Dead? Look, maybe you want to see some of those movies, but my gut says that most of you out there probably look at that list of options, and even if you kind of want to see a couple, maybe a few, most of them you just kind of... Well, folks, I get a really big because I don't want to see any of them. Not that I'd literally rather light myself on fire in protest about it or anything, but, just honestly, rather not being... So I hope you get my drift by now. I usually have to put a little extra energy to see the sorts of movies that I also put a little bit more obsessive of an energy into finding out about coming down the road and seeing, even if they're just premieres, even if they're very limited releases. And I guess that kind of makes me a snob, but hey, I also hope it means that maybe I can convince someone out there that I'm not just going to see the movies that we're all kind of expected to see, because that's what's dominating our eye sockets when we go on social media or see ads on TV or on YouTube or go on streaming or just go up to the marquee at the local theater and see what's on the menu of mass media entertainment in what I think we can all agree is turning out to be a very long first half of the 21st century so far. No, I hope that means you can trust that when I go to see a movie in the very obsessive way that I do, it's because I'm actually looking to be interested, to be engaged, not to just get passive and, God forbid, tweet and text through the whole damn thing. I hope it means that you can think, hey, maybe this guy will put me on to something I didn't know about before. Or maybe when he does see something more normal, he can put me onto a way of looking at it that I find edifying. That's a lot, I know. I should just get right down to it. This week, I was once again patronizing my local AMC because guess what, everybody? I had to dog sit this week, so I didn't get to go into the city, so I stayed right here in New Jersey and decided to really figure out what was there playing at the local AMC that I wanted to see that was not
the new Super Mario Brothers, the 4th John Wick, the 5th Evil Dead.
And folks, for me, it was a pretty easy decision to make, not because I was necessarily looking forward to the movie itself, but because sometimes you just can't help your own jaded, morbid curiosity. This week, I decided to check out HYPNOTIC. No, not that HYPNOTIC. There we go. That's the one. Folks, I went to see HYPNOTIC, the latest action thriller from writer, director, producer, cinematographer, visual effects guru, and indie film Tex-Mex maverick, Robert Rodriguez. For those of you who aren't familiar, particularly for you younger potential viewers who are just starting on your long journey into cinema, Robert Rodriguez is a Mexican-American filmmaker hailing from San Antonio and Austin, Texas, who, along with such contemporaries as Quentin Tarantino, the Coen brothers, Spike Lee, Kevin Smith, Jim Jarmusch, Richard Linklater, can pretty much be taken for granted as one of the more iconic directors to emerge from what was something of a renaissance in independent, auteur-driven filmmaking that occurred between about the mid-'80s and through much of the '90s in North America. In particular, Rodriguez is a very significant figure historically in two main respects when it comes to independent cinema. One is that, on the one hand, he's very much associated with Quentin Tarantino, with whom he's a colleague and frequent collaborator and also a close friend. But he's also generally associated with this side of the independent film renaissance that is very much focused on genre cinema, particularly very stylish crime movies as opposed to the more situationally focused dramas and comedies that tended to dominate independent cinema at that time. But then on the other hand, he's also rather significant alongside Kevin Smith and others as a figure of DIY cinema. And not just that, but really using DIY cinema as a springboard to creating what has amounted to not just a very successful personal career, but even a kind of miniature media empire oriented entirely around their own imagination, with as few compromises with outside investment or influence as possible. Rodriguez's first movie was El Mariachi, a Spanish-language film that he shot entirely on location in Ciudad Acuña for just $7,000 and basically acting in every major capacity of production and post-production except starring in the film himself. The movie premiered at the Toronto Film Festival in 1992 before going to Sundance the following year, and very soon after that was picked up by Columbia Pictures, who cleaned it up, gave it a limited release, and it was decently successful. But that's basically how Rodriguez got his foot in the door of the mainstream film industry, by proving that he could turn out not just a competently made film, but even a rather entertaining and consummate one within very limited means, and basically using that industriousness and ingeniousness with economical filmmaking to write himself a blank check for a real career in the industry, but especially a career where he could maintain a decent amount of creative control even at a very young age, at least relatively from when he was entering the industry. His real commercial breakthrough came with Desperado, starring Antonio Banderas and Salma Hayek in 1995, which is something of a pseudo-sequel to El Mariachi, but produced on a much bigger budget and for distribution by a major studio, and it was also really his stylistic breakthrough, because while that movie wasn't terribly well received by critics, not nearly as well as El Mariachi, it did really cement his cult following, and in large part because this was him showing what he could do with a certain budget and not what he could accomplish despite a certain budget, as with El Mariachi. Rodriguez has made several other films that have contributed to his cult following and the maintenance of his ability to more or less work totally independently in the film industry. He's collaborated directly with Quentin Tarantino on not one but two action horror films, the first being From Dusk Till Dawn, the second being Planet Terror, which he made as the first film in a double feature with Tarantino's Death Proof for the Grindhouse double feature project, which was kind of like this big, indulgent homage to exploitation movies of the 70s and the 80s. He would complete his so-called Mexico trilogy with Once Upon a Time in Mexico, which was also quite financially successful. He also did Sin City, a very stylish and aesthetically groundbreaking movie in terms of its heavy use of digital post-production, not just to edit the film, but to basically completely create totally novel shots in a computer computer out of very sparse, discrete elements in studio, with a lot of use of green screen and rotoscoping to create this feeling of watching a kind of moving comic book. And yet, at the same time, while all of these films are quite gritty, quite violent, quite adult-oriented, probably whether you're a millennial or even younger than that, you're most likely most familiar with Robert Rodriguez's work, as he is also the creator of the Spy Kids franchise of children's films, as well as several other children's films that he's continued to produce pretty much on and off, even as he also dips back into the well of his stylish, ultra-violent crime and thriller and genre movies. In fact, in the long run, that's probably proved to be the most iconic thing about Rodriguez, that dichotomy that he's created in not just his career, but in his persona as this very successful filmmaker who still holds very tightly to these convictions that he developed all the way back in his DIY days making El Mariachi. That he wants to control as much of what he does as possible, both for the creative freedom of it, but also for the bottom line professional freedom of it, to be able to do what he wants, to not have to make other people's movies, and more importantly, to not be put into a box as a filmmaker for hire who only gets to make one of either kind of movie, whether it's the cult genre stuff or the family-friendly stuff. And there's a lot to admire about that in Rodriguez, but here's the thing, folks, and those of you out there already more familiar with Rodriguez's films, even those of you who consider yourselves fans of his work, you all probably know where I'm going with this. A big part of why Rodriguez is such a significant figure of the independent film renaissance is that from the very outset, he directly capitalized on himself. This was something very common that came out of the final years of the independent film renaissance in America, which you particularly see with his contemporaries in Quentin Tarantino and Kevin Smith, which is that the cult following that these writer-directors built around the particular kind of movies they made was just as much based around their ability to step out from behind the camera and really cultivate a niche following by communicating directly to fans, by in some ways curating an entire extraneous spectacle and experience for themselves as film mavericks, as guys who proved that, hey, you can just be a normal person who loves movies and you can make your own movie. And Rodriguez was really out to make himself the king spokesperson of this DIY philosophy. In the same year that Desperado came out, he released a book detailing his experiences making El Mariachi called Rebel Without a Crew. He was also really forward-thinking and inventive in terms of his jumping on the potential for DVD taking over from VHS as the home video standard, really putting effort into special features, especially special features like behind-the-scenes stuff, and even his own short so-called 10-minute film schools, where he didn't just show you how he did stuff in his films, but was very emphatic about encouraging that small part of his viewers who admired him as a filmmaker and wanted to learn from him that, hey, here's how you can think your way out of something that you might see as preventing you from making a movie that you want. And there's, again, a certain extent to which that makes Rodriguez a very admirable figure in cultivating inspiration in young filmmakers and promoting a film culture that is at least nominally more critical in some ways, at least in terms of how movies get made and seeing behind the camera. And there was a definite period where he really was on the cutting edge of digital filmmaking and digital effects and harnessing the potential of both of those things and harnessing the potential of new media. All of that I can get along with. But here's the thing. Well, here's two things. One is, let's face it, the inevitable dichotomy of Robert Rodriguez is that there really hasn't been that long between him being a technically innovative filmmaker to the drop-off of him just, not being so much innovative as, cheap. Just making cheap, cheap-looking films that don't even really have the same sensual or kinetic allure of his earlier works, especially Desperado. Frankly, he never made a movie better than Desperado. Like, let's just be real, and this is going straight as a straight talk with the Rodriguez heads. Folks, let's face it, the last really interesting thing he did was Alita Battle Angel, and that's really more of a collaboration with James Cameron, and once you're doing work for hire with James Cameron, my dude, like, nice connection, but the DIY dream is over. Now it's just cheap. Like, look at these shots from what Rodriguez is doing nowadays, right? On his own dime, on his own time and dime, right? And here's what he was doing when he was just letting someone else do the cinematography. Like, dude, I get it. You're the guy who can do everything, but, like, maybe you're not the best cinematographer for your own movie. And that's really the thing that kind of bugs me about Rodriguez, since he's made it impossible to just talk about his movies, because he's cultivated and capitalized directly on a circumstance where his persona as a filmmaker is a direct part of his movies. At the end of the day, Rodriguez is a guy whose whole pro-DIY ethos always kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and it rubs me the wrong way for one reason and one reason only, because while he may, in one sense, be promoting passion in and for filmmaking, I mean, moreover, he seems to have just spent his career promoting a kind of very superficial, individualistic cynicism where he himself is really not the best at anything he does when it comes to filmmaking, but his primary message really does organically boil down to, and very early in his career, this idea that, hey, if you really want creative control as opposed to creative freedom, I think those are two completely different things. Creative control versus creative freedom. If you really want creative control, the more you know about every aspect of your craft, the more control that you have. And that as a message gets kind of problematic because, again, while I think we can all respect the theme of creative independence, creative freedom in its own kind of very important abstract, the trajectory of Rodriguez's films from really rather influential and iconic bits of American cinema, especially from the perspective of his being a kind of ambassador for Latino artists in America, to just being so weightless and boring, that's something that you can't help but root back in that very individualistic, cynical philosophy, where what Rodriguez has forgotten to emphasize for his audience, especially the generation of inspired filmmakers coming after him, is that filmmaking is a collaborative art form in which the best results are typically achieved not when one guy monopolizes the major creative influence, but when everybody really thinks about and recognizes their unique talents and how this interacts with a broader discipline about filmmaking and the talents of others. Even when we're talking about the most idiosyncratic, the most iconoclastic, and the most singularly visionary filmmakers of all time, guess what? At a certain point, most of them recognized, you know what? I really ought to get someone else in here to at least write or light a scene or write a score. Even fans of Rodriguez will often swear by movies like From Dusk Till Dawn or The Faculty being among the best films he's ever made, and while I don't really agree, I can definitely say that both films prove definitively that if it's a contest between me wanting to see a name attached to a screenwriting credit, it's going to be Quentin Tarantino or Kevin Williamson and not necessarily Robert Rodriguez. There's just no particular reason to look forward to a new Robert Rodriguez movie because with each production, he only seems to grow more insular, more self-cannibalizing, more solipsistic, and frankly, less exciting in virtually every role he chooses to monopolize for himself. And I say no particular reason to look forward to one except, yes, you guessed it, jaded and morbid curiosity. And so I saw the trailers for HYPNOTIC.
I know you called the tip in on the bank heist. Who the hell are you?
What makes total strangers pull off an elaborate bank heist?
Hands up!
But I'm the wrong man.
Where is she?
Yeah, and so I said, yeah, I have no idea what to make of this. I mean, like, the editing in the trailer just doesn't even make any sense. Like, I'm interested. The trailer isn't cutting. That's got to be interesting. I mean, morbid, jaded curiosity peaked. The trailer isn't cutting, and they put it out anyway. There's something going on here. And to the credit of an elder statesman of a very important period in American film history and renewed independency for artists, look, it's a damn sight more interesting than... So let's talk plot synopsis. Okay, so Hypnotic is about... God damn it, that's not the right Hypnotic. Whose idea was it to call the movie Hypnotic? Mr. Rodriguez, are you aware that every time I try to Google your movie, the number one recommendation is a movie with the exact same name from 2 years ago? I don't know whose job it would be to just put the title, the incredibly generic title of your movie, into a search engine just to make sure that there wasn't another similarly profiled movie with the exact same title that came out rather recently that might maybe cause some confusion with your film. I don't know whose job that would be, but it's another one where one guy's creative control over it clearly puts them at a disadvantage. Also, I just want to say, on the title front, this movie immediately makes the cardinal sin of giving itself a title that implies the effect it's supposed to have on an audience. Kind of just setting ourselves up for failure on 2 counts already here, but okay. Hypnotic, and that's the right one. Hypnotic stars Ben Affleck as Danny Rurik, an Austin police detective who has just been let back on the force after a leave of absence and psychological evaluation he was compelled to take following the kidnapping and presumed murder of his 7-year-old daughter, Minnie. After receiving a cryptic and anonymous tip, Rurik and his partner, Nix, played by J.D. Pardo, arrive at a stakeout for an expected bank robbery that Nix suspects may be part of a string of similar robberies that all involve the same pattern. A single safe deposit box is broken into, but with no money taken. Arriving at the scene, Rurik and Nix witness a strange, anonymous man, played by the wonderful William Fichtner, seemingly recruiting random people to be accomplices, using one woman to create a diversion, recruiting 2 armored car cops to shoot up the bank, getting a bank employee to grab the safe deposit box, all seemingly with a simple exchange of words and a Svengali-like trick of his eyes. Fortunately, Rurik, defying Nick's pleas, intercepts the safe deposit box before Fichtner's character can get to it. Opening the box, he discovers not money, but our first MacGuffin, a Polaroid picture of his daughter Minnie with a message written on it that says simply, "Find Lev Del Rey." Rurik and team pursue Fichtner to the top of a building, only for 2 of Rurik's own guys to turn their guns on him and then each other, shooting each other while Fichtner makes a mysterious getaway. Now, while it may not come as the biggest surprise in the world, we've clearly got a case of some mind control shenanigans on our hands. And when Rurik tracks down the person who gave the anonymous tip, a medium named Diana Cruz, played by Alice Braga, surprise, surprise, she eventually informs him that we've got some mind control shenanigans on our hands. Specifically, Fichtner's character, the mysterious Lev Del Rey in question, is a hypnotic, an individual who is able to influence and control others solely with the power of his mind, not just getting them to do as he pleases, but able to create sophisticated illusions or hypnotic constructs, as they're called in the film, that make them perceive things that aren't there and feel as if they are acting of their own volition when they are not. Cruz, as it happens, is also a hypnotic, in fact a former member, along with Del Rey, of a secret organization of hypnotics. Obviously, Rurik has pretty safe reason to believe that all this secret organization, mutant, psychic stuff has something to do with the disappearance of his daughter, and so we're off to the races in a cat-and-mouse thriller where Rurik and Cruz team up to find what's really going on while Del Rey ruthlessly pursues them for his own mysterious ends, all the while Rurik's sense of reality, of what is real, of what he is in control of, unraveling as he goes further and further down the rabbit hole. I think that's more or less enough without giving too much away, because while I don't want to say that many of the twists and turns in Hypnotic are necessarily of a quality where if you know what's going to happen going in, you'll be spoiled on it exactly. In fact, I think there's probably plenty of people who might enjoy this movie more if they prepare themselves for the absurd directions that it goes in. But there is a certain extent to which the movie really does benefit from going in completely blind from a different way of looking at it, from a similar emphasis on the absurd parts. I certainly benefited from going in blind, and when it was all over, there was a guy in the audience of maybe 4 or 5 people who actually turned up for the Thursday early screening of the movie, who one guy immediately got up as the credits were starting to roll and said, "Great, it's over, now let's go get our money back." Which, frankly, is a sentiment I understand, because I'll be perfectly honest, I was really not quite enjoying Hypnotic for more or less the first half of it or so. This really was just an instance of me going to not a low-budget movie per se, but certainly in a mid-budget range, and where it's very obvious that most of the budget went to the stars, some key set pieces, and visual effects work. It's weird saying this about a film that cost around $65 million to make, but Hypnotic really is thoroughly in that category of a modern B-movie. It's produced in a partnership of small independent companies. Its U.S. distributor is basically a total no-name called Ketchup Entertainment, and the movie itself does seem to be stretching that $65 million very thinly, or else it just appears that way, because much as he's been doing in recent years, Rodriguez seems to be deliberately moving away from the more kinetic style of shooting and editing that defined much of his career, and in favor of something that, again, doesn't really come off as distinct in its own way, but just kind of feels a little solipsistic and cheap. Like, if I had told that guy who got up, shouted, and left that Hypnotic was made for $65 million, that would definitely have pissed him off even more, because it doesn't look like a $65 million movie. And with no disrespect to the production team at all, it looks like the sort of thing where, with more unknown actors and only a little more emphasis on digital post-production than practical and location elements, it could have been a significantly lower budget movie, exclusively direct-to-video affair that you might expect from just about any fly-by-night B-movie filmmaker or producer, not necessarily one that was made by one of the most iconic figures of independent American cinema for the last 30 years. Well, maybe not the last 15 or so of those 30 years, but definitely a lot of those 30 years. And because Rodriguez's strengths are as a technician, as a sensualist, as an aesthetic filmmaker, not with performances or screenwriting, God forbid, Hypnotic becomes a very hard film to get into, especially if you're more familiar with Rodriguez's past work, because in addition to the just rather boring, mediocre production of much of it, Rodriguez seems just as ever determined at every turn to double down on his self-cannibalization of his work and his solipsism in order to lace Hypnotic with references to his past better films. There's dialogue in the movie that is a very obnoxious, direct pull quote from the dialogue in Desperado, which, dude, please do not remind us of your best movie in one of your late, not nearly as good productions. The character name Del Rain seems to be an echo of the location El Rey from Dusk Till Dawn. Rurik and Cruz end up finding out about a secret project codenamed Domino, which is the same as Consuelo Gomez's character in El Mariachi. It's really just laying everything on a little thick. Like, I even thought that it was kind of eye-rolling in Ambulance when the characters talk about how much Armageddon is a great movie. And I think Armageddon is a great movie, but it was kind of obnoxious to put it in your movie. But at least Ambulance was a doper movie, and frankly was mostly doper, not necessarily because it's much better written than Hypnotic is, certainly not, but because it was also a B action movie where you really saw the production value on the screen. Michael Bay still has the juice when it comes to really pulling out the stops and seeing where he can push the boundaries of what he can accomplish with action and set pieces. Rodriguez doesn't seem to have the same instinct. And I don't think Rodriguez can justify the same solipsism and self-reference because, for better or worse, Ambulance Ambulance at least reminds you fondly of what Michael Bay has done before, even if you don't think Ambulance is that great. Whereas Hypnotic, it might as well be referring to a better film that Rodriguez didn't make. It only kind of exists to not be understood by the vast majority of people who are just going to write it off on its cheapness and rather poor screenwriting. And for a small cohort of folks like me who are just going to be sitting there and being constantly and not fondly reminded of much better movies that this guy has made a long, long time ago. Bringing on Max Borenstein as a co-writer hasn't really seemed to make much of a difference, which comes as no surprise to me as someone who thinks that Borenstein's run as the screenwriter for the last 3 of Legendary's giant monster movies has been some of the most viscerally disappointing in recent blockbuster history, and yet I gotta say, folks, jaded and morbid curiosity can take you a long way. And I want to be very clear here. I am not saying that Hypnotic is so bad it's good or whatever. There might be a few so bad it's good moments, but they're really short, really muted, really understated. It's not the kind of movie that gets made better if you're just getting drunk and riffing with your friends. But I think there's one positive thing that I can say about Rodriguez when I take into consideration his entire body of work, much of which I'll admit I'm just not terribly fond of. I don't have the same affinity for them as a lot of people do. I am always surprised by the extent to which, for whatever I don't like about his films, whatever I find quite mediocre and derivative about his work, not even just compared to other independent film icons, but just action and genre filmmakers more broadly, I always reach a point where I am thoroughly impressed, if nothing else, by Rodriguez's ability to find a comfortable footing for what turns out to be a very offbeat and kind of naive approach to genre storytelling, even when the films themselves are often very gritty, very violent, very dark. Hypnotic is a movie that is, on the one hand, very formulaic, very obvious, and to a certain extent striking you as nothing more or less than somebody basically trying to do a B-movie ripoff of Inception or Tenet. You know what? Quite frankly, the whole look of the film and the awkward staging of it and the really not very good choreography of the action set pieces, it makes a funny amount of sense when you see it as Rodriguez and co-cinematographer Pablo Berón trying to really meticulously imitate Christopher Nolan. But on the other hand, there was a very definite turning point for me, and this was really when the sense of reality for Rourke's character really started to unravel, that I think in spite of whatever I thought the film's endemic flaws were, that as a cheap B sci-fi thriller, I really got and started to get into what it was going for in that naive, offbeat way. There's this really rather ingenious scene really about midway through the movie. This is about when my opinion started to turn on it, where Rourke and Cruz are alone and Rourke's mind is being manipulated by Del Rey, and he realizes that he's being influenced to murder Cruz, and he keeps seeing a pair of scissors that appear and disappear out of his hand and different parts of the location they're in where he thinks he leaves it. And the thing is that for a Nolan ripoff, that's actually just as clever and impactful a set piece to me as anything I've seen in, like, Interstellar. There is something definitely, again, kind of jaded and morbidly interesting about small-scale Nolanisms filtered through such a small B-movie lens. But beyond that, I think Hypnotic actually gradually goes from being one of Rodriguez's most disappointing movies to being one of his most impressive and interesting films in years, because as the sense of reality of it starts to break down, and because the presentation of it is often so mundane and non-kinetic, it really does achieve something kind of offbeat and weird and surreal in a way that's never really as cerebral or disturbing as the filmmakers want it to be, but is often, not for nothing, thoroughly enjoyable to watch in a conceptual way, in its own artistic right. Like his contemporary, Quentin Tarantino, Rodriguez's frequent cinematic influences are rather obvious. He's quite well known for cannibalizing his influences and wearing them right on his sleeve. And in this case, I think what makes Hypnotic so interesting is not as a Nolan ripoff necessarily, but as a kind of tone-perfect throwback to the kinds of B sci-fi movies that were much more common in the independent genre film generation from when Rodriguez himself was coming up. Particularly, Hypnotic is really quite reminiscent at the end of the day of David Cronenberg's Scanners. There's also clearly the kind of routine influence of John Carpenter, especially They Live. In this case, it isn't a bad reference point if you're trying to pay homage to and shoot a style of action and genre filmmaking that is not in the more kinetic style, that is more in the classical Western blocking style of someone like John Carpenter. And look, I'm a big fan of Cronenberg and Carpenter, and I don't think on balance that Rodriguez has or ever will make a movie as good as even some of Cronenberg and Carpenter's more minor works. But credit where credit is due. Hypnotic is the sort of film that is simply born out of an ethos that I can really get behind, which is that thriller and science fiction films shouldn't just be about big, saturated spectacles. They should be opportunities to explore the weird, for stuff that in some ways seems so conceptually wrong in terms of conventional dramatic storytelling and realism, but in a different context when played straight and even naturalistically, just creates such a strange emotional relationship between you and the movie. And Hypnotic just keeps getting more and more and more absurd as it goes along, but it never ventures far away from playing that absurdity out on as small a scale as possible. And if anything, the movie actually starts out at a pretty big scale that it can't quite handle and deliberately goes into a smaller scale. That seems to be a big part of what is Rodriguez's aesthetic and conceptual experiment with this movie. And at the end of the day, I really got into it because I like that kind of weird cinema, and I'm perfectly willing to accept at least a little bit of mediocrity or even just plain bad screenwriting, because I guess sometimes you need poor writing to see what one can accomplish with a cinema that is intended to purely be a cinema of the bizarre, of the strange, not something that you escape into, but something that you just watch in all of its brute address and its rough, low-budget, janky aesthetic glory. And I guess that's a mild recommendation for Hypnotic. Who knew? Bet you didn't see that coming after all of that stuff up front, but it is what it is. For real, though, if you like your movies weird, if you actually kind of like a solid B movie, you might be in for a treat. Just know what you're getting into, and I hope that this has helped somewhat in informing you about what you're getting into as far as strange, low-budget, kind of janky movies are concerned. Anyway, I'd like to thank you out there for watching. You know what to do. You know what I'm going to say. Follow, bell, yada, yada, yada. I am Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and I hope to see you all again next time on The New Movie Diary. Cheers.